I serve on that. Just got the recording message, Kathy. I serve on that and am a ruling elder at Overbrook Presbyterian in Columbus. So it's my pleasure this morning to welcome Michael Wilkos. He was going to speak to us back in January. Here he is today. Michael is a senior vice president with United Way of Central Ohio. He has a long resume that emphasizes community impact. And certainly that is what we hope to learn about today. So Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'll be muting my mic for the time being. So welcome. Thank you, Michael, for being here.
Great. Well, thank you, Tina. And it is certainly a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to talk about lots of things. I will share this slide deck after this morning's presentation because I like to use lots of maps and charts and pictures, and some of those things may be things that you would like to use for future reference. I did not grow up in Columbus. This is my adopted hometown. And for the last 18 years, I've been working as a grant maker in Central Ohio. And so one of those things is I've just been studying the needs of Central Ohio for a really long time. And what I want to do with you this morning is bring us to a common understanding of both what's happening currently in Central Ohio with regard to population growth and demographic changes and the mobility of poverty and opportunity. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history that is behind why some parts of Central Ohio are doing very well and other parts of Central Ohio continue to struggle. And because we don't want to end on a low note, we've got a couple really important, significant things that are happening in our community that I will highlight at the end of the conversation, and we should have plenty of time for a robust Q&A. So with that, I will take over the screen and begin my slide deck. And if somebody does have a question while I'm presenting, I may not, I don't see the chat, but if somebody would like to unmute and ask a question, I think we have enough flexibility that that could happen if that would be a helpful thing for you. So again, this is an incredibly significant time for change in Central Ohio, and there's nothing that is more evident around that change than when you see proposals like this. These are all three proposals right now for downtown Columbus that include residential development as the city is continuing to go vertical. But we're also seeing things like these projects, either under construction or about to start construction behind COSI in Franklinton, as much of downtown is moving over into what has been a long-term, historically low-income neighborhood on the west side. And we see projects like this on Long Street and High Street and Summit and West Broad Street, where there is clearly this momentum of significant investment coming back into the central city. And we also see projects like this throughout suburban Columbus. I'll point to the one in the top right, which is in Dublin. That's Bridge Park. It was a 1980s failed shopping center that has been replaced with a mixture of offices, condos, apartments, hotels, because Dublin is recognizing the demographic shifts of their community, which has often been larger single family homes. And they're really responding to both younger and empty nester consumers, both driven by lifestyle and convenience. So it feels like no matter where we go in Central Ohio, we can clearly see the city is changing before our eyes. And in fact, 90% of all of the growth of the state of Ohio has happened within metropolitan Columbus in the last decade. 45% of that growth was in the city of Columbus proper. The other 45% was in Columbus suburbs. And what you can see here is that the growth of the metropolitan region, that would be Franklin County and all of the counties that surround Franklin County, have been growing robustly now for the last 3 decades. And that growth has been inching up only slightly. But for those of us that work or live in Franklin County, it feels like the metropolitan region is growing so much more rapidly because of this. If you look at the chart for the 2000s, 43% of metropolitan growth occurred in Franklin County. In this most recent decade, it was 70% of metropolitan growth occurred in Franklin County. What did happen this decade was a significant shift of growth that came inward as the demographics of how Central Ohio is growing needed a very different kind of housing typology. In many of the adjacent counties, Union and Delaware, Licking or Fairfield, there's mostly a single family home or more expensive and larger single family home product being built, where in Columbus, there's a greater diversity of housing typology. And that is definitely responding to that growth of the metro. So let's just look at Columbus now real quick. The city of Columbus is now 906,000 people. In the last decade, it was the highest percentage increase of growth in the city since the 1950s. And it was the largest numeric increase in Columbus history, where the city added 119,000 people. What's significant is that the geographic annexation of the city has really come to a close. And so that growth is occurring within the city. When you compare Columbus to other Sunbelt cities, Southern cities, West Coast cities, it's surprising when people realize that Columbus is growing more quickly than Houston or Nashville, Dallas or Phoenix. Now, some of these metropolitan regions might be growing faster than Columbus Metro, but Columbus as a city is growing much faster than a lot of cities that have always been highlighted as the perennial boom town communities. And again, the annexation came to a close. The city of Columbus added just 1.5% in land area, but squeezed 119,000 more people into the city limits. There are no neighborhoods that are now really untouched by what's happening in our city. Whether you're on the urban periphery, in the urban core, or say Northland, we can see massive changes. The other thing that really happened this past decade is the growth of the metropolitan region has been the most evenly distributed. You can see that Franklin County grew by almost 14%. In blue are all of the places that grew faster than Franklin County. In orange are all those places that grew, but not as fast as the Franklin County population growth. The point here is every community is growing. Even those communities like Worthington, Arlington, Grandview, Bexley, and Whitehall that are built out and do not have greenfield development, they're also growing. We also have high growth communities like Dublin, Powell, and New Albany on the north end, which has been the perennial winner for the population growth competition. But now you've got an inner ring community like Grandview Heights, Grove City, Pickerington, Canal Winchester. Every community is experiencing growth in Central Ohio, and that equitable distribution of growth is kind of new to the region. So let's look at the county. What we see here, and I'm going to see if I can try to hide this bar at the top, or maybe I can. Maybe I can move the bar. Thank you. I want to point this map because what we see here, everywhere in green or the yellow color showed population growth in the metropolitan region. Franklin County added 160,000 people. And there are two areas that I want to point out that you had multiple census tracts that were losing population even during this population surge. One of those is the West Side. Everywhere from Cosi running out West Broad Street and Sullivan Avenue all the way to Hollywood Casino. This is an area that continues to lose households. It's losing population, mainly because of the complications around concentrated poverty, the issue around the opioid epidemic, and fears and realities around crime and safety. But if you looked at a map like this, and you just wanted to see neighborhoods that were growing and areas that were in decline, you'd look at those areas in red, and you might make the assumption that if the area has decline, then they might not be attractive neighborhoods. Well, the other area of multiple places of contiguous decline is over here south of Children's Hospital, running down along Parsons Avenue. So Whittier, Miller, Kelton. This area is losing people, not because it's on the decline, but because it is on the rapid rise. And what's happening is that low-income renter families are being replaced by professional homeowners often a single individual or a double income professional household. But when a low income family with school-aged children is being replaced by a single individual, you'll see population go down. So one of the things I just want to highlight here is that when we look at areas of population growth and population decline, that doesn't really tell us the full story about what's going on in that area. Despite this huge increase in population growth, all of the net growth in the city of Columbus in this past decade was due to an increase in people of color. That is also true for Franklin County. For both Columbus and Franklin County, the white population actually fell, and 100% of that net growth was due to increases in diversity. Here's the chart. You can look at those numbers. The white population fell only slightly, just about 3,000 people. And what you'll see is a significant increase in Asian, Hispanic, other, or 2 or more races. One of the things that is also happening is as people are getting into greater clarity about how they might define their family heritage, there were people that previously may have identified as white only or Black only, who now no longer feel that those single labels adequately describe who they are. So you are starting to see some of that shift on how the Census Bureau does race classifications. But even with that, the growth of our region is about a rapidly diversifying region. So here's the map that shows where diversity increased. Everywhere in green on this map shows places that are more diverse than what they were 10 years previously. So for Franklin County, the diversity index went from 50 out of 100 to 60 out of 100. And this increase in diversity, it's not just a Columbus thing or a greenfield suburban development or inner ring, it's happening everywhere. One of the things to point out is there's a few places where diversity fell, by Hollywood Casino, north of OSU, and here in Whitehall. It's a little misleading because those places were very diverse 10 years ago. They are still diverse today, but because of the loss of housing units or the addition of housing units, they're just not as diverse as what they were 10 years ago. Now, despite this increase in diversity, this is what we look like through the lens of places that are diverse and places that are homogeneous. In red are all of the places that are the most homogeneous, and the brighter you get into green, the more diverse those places are. Let's not pay too much attention to this area on the southern end of Franklin County. It's mostly rural. There's not a lot of people who live south of Grove City, and you see these very large census tracts, which have about the same number of people as a tiny little square colored here near the center. So I want to zoom in and talk about some other places that are homogeneous. We have Bexley, German Village, Marion Village, Schumacher Place, Grandview Heights, all the way up through Upper Arlington, the core of Clintonville, and Old Worthington. Now, what's important to acknowledge about these really homogeneous places, 4 of them are in inner ring suburbs, 2 of them are in the city of Columbus, but 5 of the 6 was really where restrictive covenants and policies that really did not allow there to be diversity when those communities were built are still playing out 100 years later. Some of that is because these are very desirable places. You have a lot of people who are generational buyers. People grow up in places like Grandview and Arlington and Worthington. They may leave the region, and when they come back, they desire to come back into the community in which they grew up. What's interesting when you look at this map is that there's 2 places that are economically homogeneous, Dublin and New Albany. But Dublin and New Albany are quite diverse through the lens of culture and race. I believe that's because Dublin and New Albany have really been built in the post-civil rights era, so they never had any of those restrictive covenants. They weren't built during that era of segregation, and they do in 2022 represent a more modern version of suburbia, where historically suburbia was developed for a white population. Even places like Whitehall that have been losing people for 50 years, Whitehall had a significant reversal, and it is now growing, and enrollment in Whitehall schools is also growing. Some of this is because there is new housing now being built in Whitehall, but there's also a significant demographic shift. And that means as single individuals who may have been original home purchasers are moving to more appropriate housing for where they are in their life cycle, oftentimes that replacement tends to be new American families with school-age children. So while the population of Whitehall is now growing, you're also starting to see some significant increases in economic vulnerability because many of these families don't particularly have high income, and now there's multiple children in the home. So that takes us to this kind of inward dive. And I'm going to highlight just a few places that had a tremendous reaction in the last 10 years. And the first is Northland. If you don't know census tract maps the way I do, let me point out some references. This is Interstate 71 here to the left. We have 270 kind of on the northern end. Easton is right here and taken out of the area of Northland. This is the 161 corridor, and this is Morse Road. It's a larger area than what the official boundaries are for Northland, but I wanted to highlight a particularly important trend. Northland is a high growth neighborhood. Every single census tract in Northland is showing population growth, and it is one of the faster growing parts of Columbus, but you would never know it if you just drove around the neighborhood. If you think about Northland, if it was its own city, it would be the 6th largest city in the state of Ohio. And in just the last 10 years, Northland added almost the entire population of the city of Bexley within a decade, or 13,700 more people live in Northland, and yet there's only 484 additional housing units in all of Northland. Now I'm going to say that again because I'm going to do that for dramatic effect. There's 14,000 more people living in just 484 additional housing units. How is that even possible? Well, for decades, since the end of World War II, the number of people living in the typical American home has been getting fewer and fewer with each decade. That trend stopped in Columbus and reversed itself in many neighborhoods. The growth of Central Ohio, which has come inward, and an era, believe it or not, of chronic underbuilding has resulted in neighborhoods like Northland and Linden, which used to have 2.2 people living per unit, now have 2.6 people living per unit, a statistically significant reversal of population per unit. The other thing that happened in Northland, it had the largest drop in vacant housing of any area in Franklin County. In fact, 48% of all of the vacant housing units in Northland have been repurposed. This is just a picture from Google Street View on Northtown Boulevard of an entire apartment complex that was offline in 2011. That was a weak housing market, and Northland is a weak housing neighborhood. But this is not complicated housing stock. We're not talking about 3,500 square foot, 3-story brick homes on the Near East Side. We're talking about this kind of product, not very old, not particularly distressed. And when you go to Google Street View today, that entire apartment complex is now back online. And so what we see in Northland was able to accommodate this surge of people because it had housing that was in existence, but not being used. So while the number of occupied units is up by 7%, the number of people living in Northland is up 15%. What's important to acknowledge is as Northland was experiencing a significant population growth, much of Northland was getting weaker and poorer because the demographic shift in Northland was significant. Now we go to Linden. Linden is also growing for the first time in 60 years. Now, we know the city administrations have been focused on Linden for some time, but because I work in the nonprofit sector and we fund 92 nonprofit organizations across Franklin County, much of which are working in basic needs, housing, homelessness, kindergarten readiness, high school success, what nonprofits have been telling us as people get evicted or they can't afford the housing that they're in, or young people who want to start their own home or household, I should say, earlier, can't do it because of the scarcity of housing and the price of housing. And so where are people living doubled up? They're living doubled up in places like Northland and Linden. And the 2020 census was the first time to confirm that kind of trend. And so again, Northland and Linden are in many ways growing because people are vulnerable in their housing, and friends and family members are needing to move in with other people they know in order to be sheltered. 11 of the 12 census tracts in Linden showed population growth, and this was also significant because when I first looked at these numbers, I thought, okay, maybe there was one really large housing development that went into Linden, because again, like Northland, you don't see construction in Linden. I was shocked. As someone who studied demographics of our city for decades now, I would not have expected this reversal of fortunes in Linden. And again, Linden is a poorer neighborhood than what it was 10 years ago, despite the fact that it is a growing neighborhood. And unlike Northland, the number of housing units in Linden actually fell by 652 units. So while the total number of housing units fell by almost 4%, the population of the neighborhood goes up 7%. Again, confirmation that people are living doubled up and sharing housing units. And like Northland, Linden was second in Franklin County for the reduction of vacant and abandoned housing, or down about 1,100. There are 1,100 less vacant structures in Linden than 10 years ago. And what we know is the city was really focused on the removal of blight in what has been a long time neighborhood that has been struggling with poverty. The city removed 403 dilapidated structures, but the number of vacant units fell by 1,100. That suggests that about 700 units in Linden that had been previously vacant had been brought back to life, as you see in this picture. The Linden housing stock is relatively simple. In fact, in some parts of Linden, it's quite small. You are now starting to see significant pressures where people are purchasing these small homes, really post-World War II ranches and bungalows a little further north in Linden, as we're starting to get spillover from Clintonville, and that's actually creating some displacement now in Linden. And when we look at the demographics of Linden, I was a little surprised to see that the growth of Linden, while the white population inched up only slightly, despite the white population dropping in Columbus and Franklin County, the growth of Linden was really driven by 2 or more other and Hispanic populations. So Linden is becoming more diverse. So it goes back to that map a few slides ago where you saw all of that green, because every place is getting more diverse. Existing neighborhoods are getting diverse because how they are changing, and suburbs outside 270 are getting more diverse because of the changes there as well. In this map, you see in green all of the places where the Black population increased in the last 10 years. And while the Black population jumped 21%, really not that much faster than the population growth overall for the community, some very, very clear trends occurred. If you look here in red, ignore this census tract because again, not many people live there and the Black population is very small. Let's focus in on the urban core. In parts of Linden, north of OSU, the Near East Side, Milo Grogan, south of Children's Hospital, running out Whittier, Miller, Kelton, south of German Village. There is a significant movement out of the central city of the Black population, and the Black population is suburbanizing at a very, very rapid rate. That really didn't start until after 2000. It picked up pace between 2010 and 2020. Now, what the census does not tell us, how much of this is gentrification, how much of it is displacement, and how much of it is choice. All 3 of those things are going on in Central Ohio because a significant amount of the Black population, here's an example of where the Black population is dropping in the central city. Again, I took an image from Google Street View. There you see Riverside Bradley, a former CMHA apartment community, was demolished and replaced with River and Rich, a market rate apartment community with studios 1s and 2s. But we also saw a drop in the Black population just northwest of OSU, and then a tract on the south side of Columbus saw the Black population fall about 42%. These are significant numbers. And if you have lived in a neighborhood for a long time and you've experienced this, it would be very noticeable how quickly the racial demographics of your neighborhood is changing. And while there is an outward movement of the Black population from central city neighborhoods, here is the location for the largest increase in the Black population. Far northeast Columbus, adjacent to New Albany. You'll see here 3 census tracts, 0.14, 0.09, and 0.15, where they all had an increase of about 200% or higher, or going from about 875 Black residents to over 2,800. In fact, New Albany High School a year ago adopted an official NAACP chapter, as 10% of the enrollment in New Albany High School are now Black students. So the Black population is rapidly suburbanizing. By the way, this is a Google image of Upper Albany West, a development built by MI Homes, and is the place for the largest increase in the Black population. Clearly, as a market rate homeownership neighborhood, this does not represent a displacement mobility pattern, but really a movement of choice. When we look at the white population, there are 3 areas that should be really no surprise if you spend a lot of time in Franklin County, where the white population dropped significantly. One would be portions of Northland, Westland, really again from Cosi all the way up to Hollywood Casino, and from the edge of Bexley all the way out to the county line. And while the white population fell just 0.4%, the share of Franklin County that is white has fallen from 69 to 60%. If this rate of change continues, there will no longer be a racial majority in Franklin County at the end of this decade. Specific places where the white population fell most dramatically, there was one tract in Whitehall where the white population came down 72%, but because of the diversity of who was replacing that white population, the diversity index for that area really didn't move as much as that reduction in the white population might suggest. But then also a particular census tract in Eastland and Northland saw these particular changes. So while the white population is dropping slightly, where is the white population gaining? It's all of the neighborhoods that used to be redlined and previously segregated. I snapped pictures on Google Street View at the top here in 2011 from St. Clair Avenue. There are those same 2 houses 10 years later. Clearly, they have both been renovated. And while I don't know these properties, based on what I saw, they're clearly a home ownership. The largest increase in the white population was the Near East Side in the census tract where the King Arts Complex and the Urban League is located. But we're also seeing a significant increase in the Driving Park area, south of Main, and of course downtown. That's mainly because downtown is just growing so much. It's growing in all kinds of ways. So now let's move into poverty and opportunity, because there is really an important understanding here about the geography of opportunity. And while this is a very prosperous region, and Columbus's better days, in my opinion, are still ahead of us, there is not an equitable experience we have with who's experiencing the opportunities of our region. These maps were created by OSU's Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and they capture these 17 indicators across these 4 broad categories of neighborhoods, jobs, health and safety, and education. We can collect this data, we can map that data and layer all 17 of these things on top of each other, and we can call that opportunity. And here's the map. The map on the left is all of Franklin County. The map on the right is urban Columbus. Let's stay on the right side of the screen. Yellow is the lowest opportunity or highest poverty, and the darker red is high opportunity and low poverty. Here you have Bexley. This is German Village, Marion Village, Schumacher Place, downtown. The short north, Grandview. The gray is the entire Ohio State University campus. And here's Interstate 71 that runs up north of the city. And here we are in Linden. If you look at the map over here to the left now, what you can see is it might take 12 miles to go from the heart of Linden to downtown Westerville, where you go from lowest opportunity to highest opportunity. What we see in the urban core is it happens just by crossing a simple street. Now, if we were Dayton or Detroit or Cleveland and the population was still dropping, people might worry about, do the challenges of an adjacent neighborhood spill over to my neighborhood? And do I have the tools and confidence to stay and fight to keep my neighborhood healthy? Well, because Columbus is growing and because we're not adding enough housing, what's absolutely happening in Columbus is spillover, that these strong neighborhoods near the urban core are jumping Parsons Avenue into that Whittier, Miller, Kelton, where you're starting to see that transition from lower income renter families into home ownership. And the other thing that makes the Near East Side a really safe bet, if you will, is it is wedged in between two high opportunity bookends. I didn't have time today to go into all of the details of the Near East Side, but I will tell you that the Near East Side had the most dramatic racial shift of any place in Franklin County. The white population on the Near East Side went from 19 to 37%, and the Black population went from 75 to 57%. Geography matters. It really dictates whether or not you'll graduate high school, develop diabetes, become a victim of crime. Where you're born and where you continue to live really determines whether or not you're going to have opportunities to move up the economic mobility ladder. This is the lens of geography. Now we enter geography and race. The map on the left is the Asian population. The map on the right is the white population. Each dot is sized according to the size that that racial group represents. And what you'll see in the map on the left is that the majority of the Asian population is living either near the Ohio State University and Northwest Franklin County. There's an emerging Asian community that's Nepali, Bhutanese, and Northland. And we're also starting to see emerging Asian communities in both New Albany and Reynoldsburg. If you look at the map on the right, what you'll see is 70% of white residents of Central Ohio are living in the highest opportunity neighborhoods or moderate to high opportunity neighborhoods. There really is only one place that is still a predominantly white neighborhood that is economically struggling, and that's the West Side. As I mentioned earlier, with crime, violence, the drug epidemic, vacant housing, the West Side, while starting to see significant changes, those changes over the last 10 years have been more recent. I believe that's because there's such a scarcity of units that housing demand is now moving into the hilltop. This next comparison, I think, tells a more important story. The map on the left is the Hispanic or Latino population. The map on the right is the Black or African American. If you look at the map for the Latino community, you'll see Whitehall, Northland, Hilltop, but also further west. Generally, the Hispanic and Latino communities, which have skyrocketed in population in the last 25 years, are living in moderate opportunity places. But if you look at the map on the right, 70% of all Black or African American residents are living in the lowest economically stable census tracts. And that's really going to matter as to whether or not Black and African American children born in this community can move up that economic mobility ladder when from the get-go, they are physically removed from where that opportunity really lies. And what's happening in Columbus is there's continuing to be reports that we are a racialized metropolitan region. In fact, for second-tier metropolitan regions, only Austin, Texas is more racially segregated than Columbus. This map done by OSU's Kirwan Institute just looks at young people, 24 and under. In blue are where white youth are living, and in red are where Black and African American youth are living. In fact, younger people are growing up more racially segregated than the rest of our city. And of course, we know that when we live in any kind of isolation, we really don't develop the healthiest of attitudes about things we don't know about. So now let's move into this, why geography matters and why the geography of race matters and how that contributes to poverty. Because the reality is family income is one of the strongest predictors as to whether or not kids are going to be academically and economically successful. In addition to the census, there's something called the economic census. It's only done every 5 years. The new one will be out soon, but I'm using the one from 2016 because it is the most recent data. And it is something that the Franklin County Poverty Blueprint really highlights. What you see on this map are the net wealth of 15 to 24-year-olds. If you look on that chart there, kind of in the top right of the slide, you'll see that in south of Lane and Upper Arlington, Worthington Hills, another census tract in North Upper Arlington, another one in south of Lane, young people already have several $100,000s in net wealth. Yet, if you're a kid just finishing high school and you're in Franklinton or Mount Vernon Avenue or out near the Afrocentric School or south of Maine, you're really not starting off with much. And in fact, for young people, income inequality really looks at about 70 to 1 if you look at these highest tracts and lowest tracts. Now, 40 years later, we look at the distribution of wealth, and you'll see that that trend just exponentially widens. So again, North Upper Arlington, 2 census tracts in Worthington, Linworth area, and Bexley, net wealth jumps to 3 million. Yet in Columbus's urban core, again, Mount Vernon Avenue, East Franklinton, near Eastland Mall, which is really the poster child for the suburbanization of poverty, and my own neighborhood of Wineland Park, people are looking at that last decade of their work life with very little assets. So what we see in this community and every other community, this is not a judgment about what's happening in Columbus, because this is true in the contemporary American geography. Income inequality starts out pretty significant for young people, and that income inequality grows over time. So now let's talk about the housing market. Every day I hear people say to me, who's going to live in all this housing that I see under construction? And the reality is we have been chronically underbuilding every year for the last decade. We are growing and we need more housing, and we're not getting it. In fact, 2020 was the highest year for new construction in 15 years, and yet it was still significantly less than what we needed for that year. 11,864 units were built. We have to build 14,000 units just to meet the growth for that year. And if we want to make up for lost time, we really need to be building about 21,000 units of housing. Now with the Intel announcement, the hydrogen car company that's coming to Columbus, the expansion of OSU, both the medical center and West Campus, I guarantee the growth rate for this coming decade will be considerably more robust than what we just experienced. We have to get the construction of housing to increase, or the housing challenge that we have is really going to be a crisis the way it is in Denver and Austin and Seattle and so many other growth cities. What we're faced with now is there is a critical scarcity of housing stock at all price points, at all levels, whether it's rental or for sale. And in fact, just last night, I saw what the 2021 building permit data was, and it actually slipped from 2020, mainly because the article said there was a significant drop in multifamily construction because communities all across the metropolitan region have really been fighting higher density and multifamily residential projects, whether they are market rate or affordable. It seems that many communities are organizing to block those projects, adding delays and slowing down the process and suppressing the amount of units that can be built in the marketplace. What this is doing is driving prices into an uncharted and unsustainable territory. So in just 2 years, the average median price of a home in the Columbus metro went up by $61,500. It is projected that we'll see another 13 or 14% increase again this year. Clearly, these double-digit increases on housing costs are really usurping gains people are making with their income. There's a lot of discussion in Columbus about gentrification. There's actually 10 times the amount of displacement happening in Columbus than gentrification, mainly because the scarcity of housing is driving up prices. Here you can see what the median price is in all of Central Ohio communities. In red are those that are most expensive, really at almost $500,000 or more. In the light blue, the Worthingtons, Gahannas, and Hilliards are those places that are running higher than the Franklin County average. And what you see with Columbus, Whitehall on the southern end of the county, even those prices are going up significantly, but they are trailing the county average. These are unsustainable price points, and they no longer match the incomes of what people are earning in Central Ohio. The same thing is happening with the rental product. This scarcity of units is really driving prices up. The other thing that we've been able to track is that in a 2-year period from 2017 to 2019, we lost 19,000 affordable rental units because landlords were able to increase those rents. 19,000 units that used to rent for below $900 are now renting for over $900. Oh, and there it is. I forgot I had that in the slide. And that issue of $899 is considered affordable. That would be, by the way, for a 2-bedroom apartment. And if you've not seen this number, this is what we should be very concerned with. We have 54,000 households that are now paying half of their income to be stable in their housing. Again, with statistics like these, this is why we're starting to see people living doubled up in the Northlands and Near East Sides, and actually in the Eastlands as well. And the rental market now is the tightest it has been since 1970. Let me give an example of why this is so important. All of our nonprofits that are trying to get people who've either faced eviction or have lost their housing or had to leave housing, the cost that they once had with landlords to get people settled has dramatically increased. But it used to be, before COVID, a person who lost their housing needed shelter for about 24 days. Now it's 59 days. And the rent that maybe those landlords paid a few years ago has also increased substantially. And then they're looking for first month's, last month's, a full month security deposit. And if you look at the costs to Central Ohio to house those that are vulnerable in their housing, the cost to do that has gone up 400% in just 4 years. So what have we learned from the new census data? Well, regional growth has been consistent with other decades. That growth is coming inward. Neighborhoods have been losing people for decades, are now gaining, whether or not they're adding housing or not. There's a significant increase in people of color in suburban Columbus and the suburbs, but mainly Westerville, Gahanna, New Albany, Reynoldsburg, Pickerington, as that movement is really going northeast and east. There is a significant increase of white residents moving back into the central city, but when you look at the Black households of choice with school-aged children going to the suburbs, the white population moving back in typically does not have school-aged children. All of our growth is due to increase in diversity that will likely continue. And while we've been inadequately building new units and the typology of units, we've had such a dramatic decrease in the number of vacant housing. The vacant houses, the few that remain across Central Ohio, are either having legal issues or significant financial repair issues. And in many ways, Columbus was able to add this growth because it repurposed a lot of that vacant housing. And the reality is, I think these housing cost pressures are going to be here to stay. But how does history really contribute to the current landscape? And we'll spend about 15 minutes to do a little deep dive into that. Here's where I grew up. My mom and dad lived in this house for 47 years. I lived in a neighborhood just adjacent to the city of Youngstown. It was in a township. There were 350 houses. All 350 were homeowners and all 350 were white. And when I was 18 years old, I just thought my neighborhood looked the way it did because organically, that's how the neighborhood grew. I never thought about history and policies and what might have contributed to that. I moved to Columbus, go to Ohio State University. I get a job leasing apartments here, Morse Road, Westerville Road these apartments were renting for $295 a month. And I worked 20 hours a week, Monday through Friday. I was the only employee on the weekends. And of course, I'm told lots of things. A couple were, if I'm showing an applicant the property, do not assign that applicant to a unit near the rental office if the applicant is a person of color. I'm also told that if I'm there working on the weekends, if I take an application from a person of color, I'm supposed to put a tick mark on the application so the home office knows the race of the applicant. This is 1988, Morse Road and Westerville Road. Now, there wasn't the internet. I was a young kid. It didn't feel right, and I didn't know what to do about it. So I called the HUD office in downtown Columbus, and I told them what I'm being instructed to do. And the person says, well, not only should it not feel right, but you're actually violating federal law. And would you be willing to keep a log of all of the times you're told to do this? Because it's very hard oftentimes to find patterns in racial discrimination. That experience as an undergraduate student really changed my life and set me off onto a journey that 35 years later I'm still working on. And honestly, in the last 2 years, I've been having lots of reflections about, am I doing enough? Am I perpetuating systemic racism? And 5 minutes later, I'm working to dismantle it, right? Am I taking a deep enough look into my own actions? And I have to be honest, I've struggled at times on how I've done that review. I've read a couple books that really have helped me gain some clarity. The first is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. She talks about how we speak about early neighborhoods and how they're socially organized through the lens of race. How did I get the message that white people were better? Well, I reflected about how people talked about my neighborhood, and it was good and safe and clean and desirable. But 2 miles down the road was Youngstown, and people talked about that neighborhood as being bad and dangerous and crime-ridden. Well, the people who lived in that neighborhood looked very different than my neighborhood. She goes on to say, she could look at property valuations. If a neighborhood is going up faster in value than the rest of the city, well, that neighborhood's probably becoming less diverse. If it's not appreciating as fast, it's probably becoming more diverse. So again, when we think about Clintonville, Arlington, Grandview, prices that are surging, they're not really surging in the same way in Reynoldsburg and Pickerington. Reynoldsburg and Pickerington are getting more diverse. Those inner ring suburbs of Upper Arlington and Grandview are not. Here's where I live now. I live in Wineland Park. It's a very diverse neighborhood. I live on the right side. I rent the other side out. I'm living on the same street my first apartment was on 34 years ago. And if you want to define me based on my age and my income and my race, I am a gentrifier. I mean, there's no way around it. There are unintended consequences of the fact that I live in a neighborhood with only an 11% home ownership rate and about a 70% poverty rate. But I've chosen to live in this neighborhood as a grant maker and practitioner because I want to more fully understand the issues of housing and history and race and class. And I share this example of where I grew up and where I got a job and where I live now, because the reality is it doesn't matter where we live. If we live in a homogeneous community or a diverse community, a place we just moved to or a place we've lived our whole lives, there's a backstory there that we all should kind of look at and more fully understand that backstory and say, am I doing enough tomorrow, right, in order to create greater economic opportunity for those who struggle in my region? Back to white fragility, Robin DiAngelo says, ask yourself, if people of color don't live in your neighborhood, why don't you think they live there? And where do they live? When you were growing up as a kid, were you encouraged to visit neighborhoods that were very different than yours? Or were you discouraged? I was discouraged. And we use sometimes code words, right? What makes a good school? Who went to a good school? Who goes to bad schools, right? You often see when houses are listed, great schools. Well, for some people, that does conjure up an image of what they think of when they think of an academically performing school. The other book that really changed a lot of my thinking was the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. Didn't know the book. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know the term anti-racist. And what he says is that this term really is about whether or not we're looking at the problems people face. Are they rooted in people or are they rooted in systems? And what he goes on to say is there's no in between of saying, I'm not racist. I will admit to all of you, 2 years ago, I would have said, I'm not racist. I now can say, and it's uncomfortable to say, I'm a racist. I don't want to be. I'm working every day, but I'm part of a culture and a system. And there are things that I do that my subconscious doesn't connect with. And the term racist is not a slur. It's not a pejorative. What Ibram Kendi suggests is that it is descriptive. Any outcome where the outcome has a racialized difference that is significantly different than what the per capita representation should look like, then that system is perpetuating racist systems, known or unknown. But what he says is that when we try to take what is a useful term and we turn it into something ugly and hateful, it really shuts people down into inaction. And what he says is, let's not be afraid of using the term racism and racist to describe policies and systems. I'm not using that term about an individual. I'm looking at that term for people. One quick example. 27% of all households in Franklin County are headed by Black women, but 64% of all evictions in Franklin County are Black women. Is eviction court racist? Is eviction court perpetuating racist systems? What is the back mapping we need to do as a community to say, why are the number of Black women losing their homes so much higher than what it should be based on the demographic distribution in our community? So now let's go into kind of a quick understanding of zoning and how we ended up getting Linden and how we got Northland, or my neighborhood of Wineland Park. There have been 3 types of tools. There's racial zoning, expulsive zoning, and exclusionary. Racial is exactly what it says. Expulsive is, hey, we just don't want those factories next to people's houses. And exclusionary says, well, we don't want low-income people living next to wealthy people. And all of these have been deployed in every American city. Zoning did come to this country from Germany. It's really focused on building sizes, density. We wanted to separate land uses. But the first time a city government created a racial zoning code was in Baltimore in 1910. It was struck down by the courts just 7 years later. But despite being struck down, that kind of tool really kind of moved into restrictive covenants in the real estate industry. I share this excerpt from the 1910 Baltimore Plan. Please read the quote. I think given that we're coming out of an endemic, the use of the word quarantine, that the reason to do racialized zoning was to prohibit people of color giving diseases to white neighborhoods. Pretty outrageous thinking just 100 years ago. But then we move into these restrictive covenants. This slide was created by the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. It was created by the book Planning in the Private Interest by Patricia Burgess from the Ohio State University Press, where she does a deep dive into all of the communities, both in Columbus and Columbus suburbs, that use restrictive covenants. And I will admit that the terms on the right side of this slide, while incredibly offensive, and they are very difficult to even read, they were written thousands and thousands of times in real estate transactions all over Franklin County and every other city across the country. There was also the use of something called the Homeowner Loan Corporation Assessment. These were banks and insurance agents that want to know they are insuring something that has economic viability, and they would look at those physical conditions, right? Are there sewers and drains? Are the buildings dilapidated? But they'd also look at the social conditions, and you can read the box there of other things these assessors would be looking for as they would rate the economic viability of certain neighborhoods. And there were tiers from high to those that they consider to be hazardous for investment. This is the map that was created through that redlining experience. Hopefully over the last 2 years, this map has come your way multiple times. What you'll see here in green are those areas that were first grade: Clintonville, Arlington into Grandview, Bexley. Those areas in the pink salmon color near Children's Hospital, Mount Vernon, Longstreet, the edges of the short north and into Milo Grogan, and Franklinton. Sound very similar to the places that have historically been struggling. But this was the mid-1930s, right? 85 years ago. I'll give an example where when the 1,000 acres was launched for Lane Avenue and south of Lane Avenue in Upper Arlington, you can see the original marketing brochure. What it says here is those lots are to be restricted. They are restricted with architecture and lot size and materials, but there were also restrictions on who could live in Upper Arlington. It is interesting, and I don't know if I have that slide coming up or not, the most homogeneous census tract in all of Franklin County is actually where this brochure highlights. The area of Lane Avenue at Whole Foods, south of Whole Foods, is the most homogeneous place in Franklin County, and it was homogeneous when it was developed in the 1920s. Go about 50 years later, and there was a suit that was filed against the Northwest Arlington Homeowners Association, acknowledging that an MD from New Jersey, who is a doctor of color, wanted to buy a house on Sherwin Road. And the Northwest Arlington Homeowners Association blocked that sale, purchased the home, and then flipped it to King Thompson in 1970. There's a picture of the house that that doctor was looking to buy. And the court ordered in 1970 the Arlington Northwest Homeowners Group to be dissolved because there was a clear pattern that that homeowners group was organized specifically to circumvent fair housing laws. So now those things have ended, and they ended a long time ago. Really, by the late 60s and early 70s, restrictive covenants were gone. But in research that said, well, what's been happening in, say, the last 40 years, as we all know, the same houses in Westgate and Driving Park were built in Clintonville and built in Grandview, but they carry very different price points. And what this research really suggests by Rice is that people even today continue to build significant economic wealth off of former policies that, while they've been taken off the books, people are still in effect building wealth because those neighborhoods continue to be desirable today because they were deemed the most desirable 85 years ago. And for those of us like me who work in many low-income neighborhoods, the impacts of redlining and segregation are still very, very clear. You can read the list down the left side of this slide. I'll show you some maps near the end that highlight all of United Way's partners, but let's just go with the top one, less tree cover. You can literally go to Google Satellite and you can kind of find the neighborhoods that were redlined because you can actually see roads and you can see rooftops. But Victorian Village and Grandview and Clintonville look like forests because there's such an incredible tree canopy, largely driven by generation after generation of homeowners who've been replanting that canopy. But in low-income neighborhoods, as those trees have been distressed, they do not get replanted. And even last year, National Geographic ran a piece. They looked at Atlanta, they looked at Los Angeles and said, redline neighborhoods can get to be 15 to 18 degrees hotter than neighborhoods that were tier 1 during the era of redlining because they simply don't have tree coverage for that cooling effect. So World War II ends. There are these policies that build freeways, open land for development. 99% of all the housing and urban development funding that went to open up the suburbs in the post-World War II era went to white-only residents. In fact, where we look at the area that was deemed hazardous, Parsons and Livingston, you can see what happened in just a 14-year period. Well, because the area was deemed hazardous, it then was easy to build Interstate 70, 71 through that neighborhood because it was a hazardous neighborhood that had a low rating. Then it also became a neighborhood where urban renewal was able to remove thousands of housing units. Now, it also happens to be where Nationwide Children's Hospital was built, and is a huge economic engine and generator. That hospital is creating huge vitality for a portion of the city that has really struggled since urban renewal and highway building. So I am very thankful that Nationwide Children's Hospital is where it is and is able to invest in the neighborhood around them. But the origin story for why the highway was built where it was and how the hospital was able to acquire so much land is rooted in these policies that really disadvantaged people of color. So now we compare the map on the left from the 1930s of redlining, and the map on the right was where the foreclosure crisis happened in 2006. And the foreclosure crisis started in 3 neighborhoods, predominantly neighborhoods of color: Linden, the South Side, and portions of the Hilltop. And there were 3 phases. From here, it grew out. And the third phase that really got a lot of attention is when the foreclosure crisis was really hitting the Hilliards and Canal Winchesters of the world. And now we use the 1935 redlining map, and we compare that to a 2010 map the Ohio State University did that looked at where the private sector is still issuing predatory loans. Buy here, pay here, check cashing, and you're going to see some very clear patterns. Here is Parsons Avenue on the Near East Side. There's the curve in the river for Franklinton running out West Broad and Sullivan. And the racial demarcation line that you saw earlier, there is the railroad track that runs along Interstate 71, focusing on Milo Grogan and into Linden. So now I'm going to quickly just show you other social issues that are connected to poverty and the history of discrimination. Here we have infant mortality. Some of those areas outlined in black have infant mortality rates that look like developing nations. Here we have that opportunity map. The brighter red, the greater the opportunity, and each dot is where the victim or the shooter was a person of color. There is a direct correlation between economic opportunity of parents and where youth are being engaged in gun violence. In many ways, up until the surge of homicides these last 2 years, the majority of society really wasn't paying attention because it wasn't happening, right, in neighborhoods in which they live or frequent or work. Here we have legal aid society. This is evictions. Remember when I said it's 27% Black female-headed households, but 64% of evictions are Black women. Linden, Near East Side, South Side, Hilltop, again, those neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous in the 1930s. Here we have where people lived right before they were incarcerated. Here we have food pantry use mapped by Mid-Ohio Food Bank. And here, life expectancy in Central Ohio can range 24 years. In bright blue, New Albany, Dublin, Upper Arlington, Worthington, life expectancy there can be up to 24 years greater than the area you see in the rust color. In fact, the most dramatic discrepancy in life expectancy is between Franklinton and Upper Arlington. An Urban Land Institute report said that Arlington to Franklinton, separated by 3 miles as the crow flies, is the second most unequal pair of neighborhoods in the United States after a set in Memphis. So another book that I highly recommend is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, where he says we have created a caste system in this country with African Americans exploited and geographically separate. And while these policies are now off the books, we've not really remediated their effects, and income and economic and quality of life discrepancies continue in 2022 despite our progress. And so while the challenge that we all have to ask ourselves is that while we might theoretically agree, oh, okay, society is unequal and unfair, but it gets really hard. Well, what can I do at a personal level, at my job, in my neighborhood, in my social groups, in my faith community? And so the question is an open-ended question, what are you willing to do? And that's a journey that I continue to contemplate and reflect on. There are 4 things happening right now where there's massive momentum. The first is Link Us. This is a multi-billion-dollar effort by CODA to significantly invest in a huge transportation system that will reinvent the transportation geography of this region and dramatically increase connectivity. There's a lot of jobs in this region. We will be adding jobs. There is a difficulty in connecting where people live who need them and where those opportunities are going. If you heard the mayor's State of the City address this week, the zoning code is 70 years old. It no longer responds or provides a template for how the city wants to grow. And all of this fighting and pushback and stopping of housing is really starting to cause a strained housing market, because the reality is a house is where a job goes at night. And in 2019, the city of Columbus, for the first time ever, put $50 million into a bond package for affordable housing to kind of test those waters. How will the voters respond? Because bond packages are normally sidewalks and sewers and streetlights. But what the city is now saying is affordable housing is just as important capital improvement. And in the bond package that will go up to voters this fall, there will be $150 million in that bond package for affordable housing. The 50 million from 2019 leveraged another 250 million, and it created 1,300 housing units. So by tripling that bond package, we might be able to make a significant dent in affordable housing, because the reality is the federal and state governments will not be coming to our rescue. And lastly, source of income ordinances. If you don't know this tool, there were only 6 places in Ohio that had them, and in September of 2020, Bexley became the 7th. What this means is landlords may no longer exclude any legal source of income to qualify you for an apartment. Alimony, child support, Social Security disability, veterans benefits. There are many landlords that will only look at earned income to qualify you. Since Bexley passed a source of income ordinance, Columbus, Reynoldsburg, Westerville, Whitehall, and Worthington have also approved source of income protections. This may be the single and fastest way we could move to a housing justice platform. If you live in one of those communities that I did not mention, I would encourage you to talk with city council members, go speak to city council about following the leadership of so many other Central Ohio communities in this space. And so it's a growing region. There's a lot going on. And I do think that this is going to be a make or break decade. And I hope if Linkus and the zoning code and the bond package and source of income protections move forward, we will in fact have a far more economically equitable region in the future and begin to tear down some of those things from the past. And with that, we've still got some time for some questions. So I will stop sharing my screen. How y'all feeling?
That was an incredible amount of information, excellent presentation. Just wow, my head's just about to explode.
There's a lot there, and I do it all without notes at this point, by the way.
Wow.
Very impressive.
We do have one comment in the chat that Les Sauer made early on. Linden and Northland, the large number of refugee resettlements.
Yes, clearly. So, the other example would be someone like myself as a single individual might have lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Northland 20 years ago. And when Lazarus, Sears, and JCPenney, pick up and move on, and I might not think the neighborhood is holding up as well. If I also move out to those newer apartment complexes that are being built further out, and then I get replaced, by a family of 4 or 5 from Bhutan. What's really interesting, Leslie, is an Ohio Wesleyan geographer pulled every business permit issued by the city of Columbus in the 8 years after Northland Mall closed. And what he found was, of the 180 new businesses started on Morse Road, the vast majority of them had either African or Latino surnames. And so there were more new American businesses created on Morse Road than what Northland Mall had in its peak. And while Northland has become more economically vulnerable, this significant increase in population has offset that economic vulnerability by adding more purchasing power in the neighborhood. And this is why you see so many smaller entrepreneurs. I also will reflect that I feel that the Giant Eagle on 161 and the Kroger at Northern Lights, those closed not because there aren't consumers, but because they weren't able to appeal to the changing demographics. Because now you have, Lamico Cana and Saraga. Saraga took over the Toys R Us. Saraga took over the Kroger at Northern Lights. They're able to make it economically because they're selling the product mix that really aligns with the demographics of those regions. And if you're a Dayton or Cleveland or Youngstown, right, in many ways, Columbus is experiencing many of the same phenomenon as those places. The white middle class is picked up and moved further out. The Black middle class does pick up and move out. And if you don't have a growing population base or changing diversity, you don't really have new population groups to repopulate those neighborhoods. And so in many ways, I'd like to suggest that Morse Road in Northland is just as local, it's just as entrepreneurial as the Short North was in its heyday. And it happened in half the time without any of the effort, because Northland was really responding to this global diaspora that was kind of playing out on the streets of the north side of the city.
Michael, we may have some people attending today's meeting who live outside of Franklin County, because our presbytery extends into Licking County, into Hocking County, Delaware County. Briefly, how will these changes in the Columbus metro area impact our surrounding counties and communities?
Well, they definitely will. There's a couple things to think about. Franklin County is kind of filling up. So, even though growth is coming inward and it's that, multifamily or dense housing, the reality is when you look at all of Franklin County to the north and to the east, it is essentially built out. There is a cap of what can happen west because of the Big Darby watershed. And so unless that development dramatically leapfrogs over like Big Darby and goes into Madison County, I don't think that you're going to see, you're going to see the distribution centers and those kinds of things. I would say that Delaware, Licking County into Morrow County, those places are going to be experiencing unprecedented change, mainly because of the 10,000 affiliated jobs with Intel, which could be 20,000 and 30,000 and 40,000 jobs. And what I am concerned with the most is that many of these smaller and rural communities are not prepared for the growth that is about to come. And in an effort to want to slow growth, communities will want to legislate larger homes and larger lot sizes, which will only increase housing costs, increase sprawl. And so my advice would be, is if you look at the Marysvilles and the Johnstowns, you do want to build dense, walkable housing that allows young people and empty nesters a walkable sense of community kind of near the core. I am a believer that we have some of the most productive and beautiful farmland anywhere in the world. And I don't want to unnecessarily see us lose that, particularly with lack of predictabilities on the planet, right? I mean, one of the reasons for Intel is so the United States is not so vulnerable with regard to the computer chips. I also don't want us to be vulnerable when it comes to food. And so I really want to protect the farms as much as we can. And the only way to protect the farms of Central Ohio is to not let developers build half-acre and 1-acre subdivisions. So the interesting thing about the question from Carol about Intel, we couldn't be luckier to get something like Intel, because a good portion of those jobs at Intel do not require a high level of educational attainment in order to get those jobs. Some jobs need 2 weeks of training, some jobs need a year, but I think it's something like 1/3 of all the jobs at a typical microchip plant do not require advanced education to qualify for that job. And these are, in fact, these good paying manufacturing jobs and supplier jobs that are, the new economy, but they're not working in an office job. So I think if we can work on the affordable housing and the transportation connection, I think Intel is going to be a big victory for the region. And if you reflect that Honda came to town more than 40 years ago and how far Honda is away from the population even today, Intel is like right there, right? I mean, when you're at Easton, you're like, you could be at the Intel plant in like 8 minutes. So it has accessibility, it has a variety of different jobs, and there is a significant amount of investment going into workforce development training. So I think we are blessed to receive such a significant investment. However, a house is where a job goes at night, and we're not building enough housing, and we seem to be resistant in those more rural and ex-urban communities. They want to stay rural, and so they're kind of fighting housing. And I do think that's where the battle line is going to be drawn, is really around housing.
Other questions, either in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask? Les?
Thank you. I have another question. I was interested in your comment about source of income initiative or whatever. I don't believe that's a regulation in Hilliard where I live. And I am feeling somewhat guilty. I retired from Louisville and moved to Columbus, first settling in Clintonville, and was only there a few years, and then moved to Hilliard. And in neither place have I become a part of the civic or political activity. But I would be interested in your suggestion of where's the best place to plug in to push for something like that in a local community.
So we have the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, and I can connect you with Carly Booz, who is the director of the Affordable Housing Alliance, and she has great resource guides and incredible information, and she's helped people organize public testimony in support of source of income protection laws. To my knowledge, none of the communities where source of income protection laws have advanced has a body of local government turn them down. So I think in some places, we just need to find people who will take, leadership and ownership to begin to advance that conversation with their elected officials. We are talking about veterans, right? We're talking about people with Social Security. These are legal sources of income, and we just need to make sure that everybody can get enough access to good quality housing in a good neighborhood that meets their needs, and people should not be getting denied because they have some kind of government support. It's not just about Section 8, right? It's about lots of other things too.
Well, thank you.
So I can make that connection for you.
Other questions or comments, reactions?
I have a follow-up question, Carol. Tina, I'm sorry. It's along the same lines. I'm curious.
Well, I think he froze. It was that good of a question. He needs
It was. I'll text him and tell him they froze.
Okay.
Maybe put it in chat.
Follow-up
Barbara?
question. Hi. So my question relates to the issue of eviction. You mentioned some of the challenges that Franklin County experiences regarding eviction, and I know that there's been some effort being undertaken to make some changes to the processes and the requirements. Where is the energy on that? And is this Alliance on Affordable Housing looking at eviction issues? Or where's that being led?
Yes, so there is significant financial resources in this community right now for eviction. There is a site actually called Rentful. I think it's 614 Rentful. And so because of the stimulus dollars that have come from COVID, there's more money right now in the community, so it's about accessing those dollars. The reality is, though, those stimulus dollars will run their course, and with prices going up so much faster than incomes, that problem will reveal itself yet again. But yes, the energy there lies with the Affordable Housing Alliance on that work.
Thank you.
Sure. And that, by the way, could be, Carly is a great presenter, and Carly is an expert on housing far more than I am. And she might want to come to a future meeting that you have to talk about these specific housing strategies, and specifically tactical ways in which you can lend your voice as a faith community to advance those.
Great.
The question in the chat was about inclusion of rent responsibility being included on credit reports. Rent is often not counted as financial stability because of its cash, not credit. That is a specific question that unfortunately I'm not close enough to the issue to give a educated answer, but that is a specific question that Carly Booz would be able to give you an answer immediately off the top of her head.
And Michael, you'll share her contact information
I
with us
will.
so we can pass it on.
I will forward you the link to the slide deck from today, so you all have the slides, and I will give you her contact information. Yeah, I think if you give me a second, I might be able to find that momentarily, that site. And what I'll do is I'll also put that in the email follow-up. So I don't try to spend time with you all here today trying to look for it while we're wrapping up.
Just as a reminder, because I remember to push the recording button, this will be recorded. It will be available on our Presbytery's YouTube site. If you're not familiar with that, if you go to YouTube and you put in Scioto Valley Presbytery and click there, you will have a whole lot of videos that have been from Presbyterian women to the global mission to the PI training events. But this will be under the playlist of Matthew 25, and that's where you'll find this. So I certainly hope that it will be in the PSV Weekly email next week, but it's worth sharing with your neighbors and friends and church members. Again, this is just really powerful, well-presented information that I think we want to spread far and wide.
I certainly have appreciated the opportunity to share it with you this morning, and look forward to doing the follow-ups.
Thank you, Michael. I'm seeing applause
Yes, thank
in
you.
our picture boxes. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, but also thank you for the work that you are doing and the mission that you are on that is helping our greater community. So we give thanks for you. There it is.
I appreciate that very much. You all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Okay.
As our closing, there are two things I wanted to bring up for those people and those churches that are associated with Presbytery. Following Easter, in that period from Easter until Pentecost, the Commission of Nurture and Outreach is issuing a challenge that our churches document 2,022 hours Presbytery-wide of service to what we and the Matthew 25 folks would call the least of these. Those hours will be totaled up and celebrated soon after the end of Pentecost in our larger outreach. So it's not that every church has to do 2,000 hours. It's that we as a presbytery have committed to that larger outreach and assistance. So there is that piece. The other thing that I would point out is if your church is interested in learning more about the Matthew 25 invitation, our presbytery is a Matthew 25 presbytery. Reach out to me, reach out to Kathy, Jeannie Harsh, and we will gladly answer any questions you have. Remembering that two of those focus points are to eradicate systemic poverty, and we certainly had a lesson in that today, and to dismantle structural racism. So there are so many connections, there is so much overlap, and there are so many opportunities for us to respond faithfully. And so as our closing today, I happen to have one of my favorite hymns open in front of me, and you're probably all familiar. I am not going to sing it, but I'm going to share the wording of 2 stanzas that come from Called as Partners in Christ's Service in the blue hymnal that I keep on my piano. It is hymn number 343. Jane Parker Huber is the author, the poet. Christ's example, Christ inspiring, Christ's clear call to work and worth. Let us follow, never faltering, reconciling folks on earth. Men and women, richer, poorer, all God's people, young and old, blending human skills together, gracious gifts from God unfold. Thus new patterns for Christ's mission in a small or global sense. Help us bear each other's burdens, breaking down each wall or fence. Words of comfort, words of vision, words of challenge said with care. Bring new power and strength for action. Make us colleagues free and fair. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
And hello, Mark Stansberry.
Again, thank you all for being on. We'll get an email out with all the information that we've shared.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.